The ballroom was glowing with golden light, chandeliers sparkled above the crowd, and the sound of laughter mixed with the soft clinking of glasses filled the air. It was the night of a grand charity gala, an event where the city's wealthiest gathered every year. Guests arrived in glittering gowns and finely tailored suits, carrying with them the air of confidence that came from being seen in the right places. Every detail of the evening had been carefully planned, the decorations, the menu, the speeches. And at the heart of the night's entertainment was meant to be a world-renowned pianist, whose music would set the mood for the evening. Among the servers moving quickly and quietly through the room was a young waitress. She carried trays of champagne, refilled glasses, and placed plates of hors d'oeuvres in front of polished guests. She worked with the quiet efficiency expected of her, but her eyes kept drifting toward the stage. At the center of it stood a grand piano, its glossy black surface reflecting the lights of the chandelier. To anyone else, it was simply part of the decor, waiting for the performer. But to her, it was something far greater, something that pulled at her heart every time she caught sight of it. She had been working at the hotel for only a few months, but every time an event like this took place, she found herself stealing glances at the instruments, the performers, and the music. She never spoke about it with her co-workers. They only saw her as quiet, hardworking, and reliable. None of them knew that after every shift, she would walk home and sit by an old upright piano in her tiny apartment, practicing for hours until her fingers ached. To her, the piano was more than wood and strings. It was a voice she had learned to trust when words failed her. The night moved on, and the guests grew more impatient. The pianist had not yet arrived. The host tried to ease the situation with polite conversation and an extended dinner service, but whispers began to spread around the room. People checked their watches, complained to each other in hushed tones, and glanced at the empty stage. A few guests even joked about how long it would take before the entertainment arrived. At one of the long tables near the stage, a group of men in tuxedos chuckled among themselves. One of them noticed the young waitress lingering nearby, waiting to collect empty glasses. He pointed toward the piano and, with a smirk, said loudly enough for others to hear, "Maybe she can play for us." His friends laughed, and the waitress lowered her gaze quickly, pretending not to have heard. She hurried away with the tray in her hands, cheeks burning. She had grown used to moments like these, being invisible and yet noticed only when someone wanted a quick laugh at her expense. Still, the comment left her with an ache she couldn't quite shake off. She returned to the service station, busying herself with folding napkins and checking orders, but the sound of laughter from the table stayed with her. And each time she passed by the stage, her heart tugged harder. That piano was just sitting there waiting as if it were calling her name. The evening dragged on. The guests had finished their main courses, and still no performer had arrived. The host finally stepped up to the microphone, offering apologies and excuses about traffic delays. The audience clapped politely, but the atmosphere had changed. The energy in the room felt restless, as though everyone was waiting for something that wasn't coming. The waitress found herself standing in the corner of the ballroom, balancing an empty tray against her hip, watching the host struggle to keep the crowd entertained. She thought of all the nights she had dreamed of playing in front of people, not for fame or recognition, but simply to share the music that lived inside her. But here she was, dressed in a plain uniform, expected to stay in the background while the very instrument she loved most stood untouched in front of hundreds of guests. A voice broke through her thoughts. "Why don't you give us a song?" It was the same man from earlier, his tone dripping with sarcasm. His friends chuckled again. Some nearby guests turned their heads, curious. The waitress froze, unsure of what to do. She wanted to disappear, to blend back into the sea of servers moving through the crowd. But another part of her, the part that had spent countless nights practicing, longed to sit at that piano, even just for a moment. The host laughed politely at the man's remark and quickly moved the conversation along. But the seed had already been planted. A few guests whispered, some with amusement, others with genuine curiosity. The waitress placed her tray down on a side table and stepped away slowly. She wasn't sure what she was about to do. Her mind told her to return to her duties, to avoid embarrassment, to keep her head down, but her heart urged her forward. She walked toward the stage, her footsteps almost drowned out by the noise of the crowd. Her hands trembled, and she could feel her pulse quicken. A few people noticed her movement and whispered to each other, surprised to see a waitress approaching the piano, By the time she reached the steps leading up to the stage, the room had quieted slightly, curiosity spreading like a wave. She paused at the edge of the piano, staring at the glossy keys that seemed both familiar and intimidating under the bright lights. For a moment, she questioned everything. What if she made a mistake? What if they laughed? What if this became another memory of humiliation she would never forget? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, remembering the nights she sat alone in her apartment, hearing her mother's voice encouraging her to never give up. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the bench. The crowd grew quieter, unsure whether to laugh or watch. A few raised their eyebrows, expecting an awkward display that would provide more amusement than music. But the young waitress placed her fingers gently on the keys, steadying her breathing, feeling the familiar weight beneath her hands. In that moment, the noise of the ballroom faded, and all that remained was her and the piano. Though she had not yet played a single note, the energy in the room shifted. The guests, once restless and impatient, now leaned forward with curiosity. No one quite knew what to expect. The waitress's heart raced, but a calm determination settled over her. She was no longer just a server at a gala. She was a musician about to speak in the only language she truly trusted, the language of music. The night that had begun as another routine shift for her was on the verge of becoming something else entirely. And while she could not yet see how the evening would unfold, she knew one thing for certain. Once she touched the keys, there would be no turning back. The room was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that comes from peace. It was the quiet of expectation, the kind where every person waits to see what happens next. Hundreds of eyes rested on the young waitress sitting at the piano. Some were filled with disbelief, others with curiosity, and a few with amusement, as though this would surely turn into a brief moment of embarrassment. No one could have imagined she would actually touch the keys. She sat with her back straight, staring at the piano in front of her. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, trembling slightly. For a second, she thought about standing up and walking away. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was meant to stay at the edges of the room, carrying trays, refilling glasses, making herself invisible. But the thought of walking away now felt impossible. Her chest was tight, her breath uneven, but deep inside, something stronger than fear was pushing her forward. She had spent her whole life hiding her music. Maybe this was her only chance to let it out. When she finally pressed down on the first key, the sound was soft but clear. The note rang through the air, reaching every corner of the ballroom. She pressed another, then another, her hands slowly moving into a pattern she knew by heart. The melody was simple at first, quiet and careful, as though she was testing the ground beneath her feet. The audience leaned in, still unsure whether to laugh or listen. Then something shifted. Her fingers grew steadier, her touch more confident. The soft melody began to grow, weaving together notes that carried both sadness and hope. It was a piece she had played many times alone in her apartment, late at night when the world outside was still. She had written parts of it herself, though she had never told anyone. Every note came from memories, from long days and lonely evenings, from moments of loss and dreams that never seemed to fit into her life. The ballroom was no longer filled with restless chatter. The clinking of glasses and low murmurs had disappeared. One by one, conversations stopped, as though the music had reached into each person and asked them to pause. People who had been checking their watches moments before now turned fully toward the stage, their faces softening. She felt it too. The fear that had nearly kept her silent melted away, replaced by something she hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. Her hands moved faster now, her whole body swaying gently with the rhythm. She wasn't thinking anymore. She wasn't worrying about what the crowd thought of her or what they might say when she was done. She was simply playing. She let the music flow through her, and in that moment it felt like the piano was no longer an object. It was a living part of her, breathing with her, speaking through her. The sound rose and fell like waves, sometimes soft and delicate, sometimes bold and powerful. Her eyes closed as her fingers danced across the keys. She didn't need to look. The music had long since become part of her muscle memory. She remembered all the times she had played alone, imagining an audience that wasn't really there. Now the audience was real, and instead of frightening her, it gave her strength. From the front tables, some of the wealthy guests who had been quick to laugh earlier now sat silently, their expressions unreadable. A woman in a sparkling silver dress lifted a hand to her mouth, as though caught off guard by the emotions rising inside her. A man beside her, who had been busy making jokes only minutes ago, now leaned forward with his elbows on the table, eyes locked on the pianist. The room, filled with people who usually guarded their emotions carefully, was slowly being transformed. Every story she carried inside her seemed to spill out in the music. The struggles of working endless shifts, the pain of dreams set aside, the joy of discovering the piano as a child. All of it was here, woven into the melody. She played as if she were speaking directly to each person in the room, telling them things she could never put into words. Minutes passed, but no one moved. Even the servers along the walls, her co-workers who had been rushing with trays, now stood still, eyes fixed on the stage. The host, who had been anxiously waiting for the professional pianist, forgot all about schedules and programs. He simply stood off to the side, hands folded, listening like everyone else. The young waitress leaned into the music, her shoulders rising and falling with every phrase. Her face softened, almost glowing in the stage lights. She no longer looked like a worker serving tables. She looked like she belonged there in front of that piano, with the entire room waiting on her next note. It was as though the music had pulled away the walls that separated her from everyone else. The melody built to a high point, filling the ballroom with sound that was both powerful and tender. The air felt heavy with emotion, like something invisible was pressing down on every chest, squeezing every heart. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others sat frozen, watching her hands move with a grace they could hardly believe. A few whispered softly to the people beside them, but even those whispers carried awe instead of mockery. She played as if this was her one and only chance to be heard. And maybe it was. She didn't know what would come after tonight, but in this moment, nothing else mattered. Every struggle, every long night, every tear shed when she thought no one cared. All of it had led her to this piano, this room, these people. And for once, they were listening. As the music softened again, drifting into its final phrases, a kind of stillness spread across the room. The notes became slower, gentler, almost like a lullaby. It was as if she was letting the audience glimpse a softer, more vulnerable part of her soul. Her fingers slowed, then rested on the final chord, letting it ring through the air before fading into silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The last note hung in the air and the audience sat frozen, caught between disbelief and wonder. Then, almost as one, they erupted into applause. The sound was loud, full, and genuine. People rose from their chairs, clapping and cheering, some shouting words of praise. The same crowd that had laughed at her only minutes ago was now on its feet, giving her the kind of response she had only ever imagined in her dreams. The young waitress sat still for a moment, overwhelmed. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled them back from the keys. She had not expected this. Not the silence, not the applause, not the way the room seemed transformed. She blinked quickly, trying to hold back tears, though her chest felt light in a way it hadn't in years. The applause continued, echoing through the hall. A few guests even shouted for her to play again, their voices rising above the clapping. She stood slowly, bowing her head, unsure of what else to do. She had come to the piano almost by accident, pulled by a force she didn't fully understand, and now, standing before a crowd that couldn't stop cheering, she realized something she had long hidden. Her music was meant to be shared. Her co-workers clapped too, some exchanging surprised looks. They had never known she could play, never guessed that the quiet girl carrying trays of glasses held such a gift inside her. Even the host, who had worried about the evening falling apart, looked relieved and amazed, nodding with gratitude toward her. The applause went on, until finally, it began to soften. The young waitress stepped back from the piano, her legs unsteady but her heart full. She had given a part of herself to the crowd, and for the first time in her life, people had truly listened. Whatever came next, she knew this moment would stay with her forever. The applause slowly faded, though the echoes of it seemed to stay in the air. The young waitress stood beside the piano, her heart still racing, her cheeks flushed with warmth. She had played as though the world had stopped, and now the world was staring back at her, not with laughter, not with scorn, but with admiration. For a moment, she almost didn't know where she was. The room, the faces, the noise, it all blurred together. The only thing she was certain of was the steady beat of her heart and the piano keys still trembling under her fingers. The guests began talking again, but this time the tone was different. There were no smirks, no dismissive glances. Instead, people were leaning toward one another, whispering in amazement, shaking their heads as though they couldn't quite believe what had just happened. A man near the front clapped his hands together one last time and said loudly, "Bravo!" Others quickly echoed his words. The applause returned briefly, softer now but filled with genuine feeling. The young waitress gave a small nod, her lips curving into the faintest smile. She wanted to slip away, to return to the safety of her work, to blend back into the background as if nothing had happened. But before she could move, the host stepped onto the stage, smiling warmly. He reached for the microphone and addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I think we can all agree that we have just witnessed something extraordinary." The audience broke into another round of applause, and the waitress felt her chest tighten again. She lowered her eyes, not used to being in the center of so much attention. The host continued, "This young lady who only moments ago was serving your tables has given us a gift tonight. Music straight from the heart." The waitress felt her throat close up. She wanted to say something, but her voice wouldn't come. The host gave her an encouraging nod before turning back to the crowd. "I don't think any of us expected this evening to take such a turn. But perhaps," he said with a smile, "it turned in exactly the direction it was meant to." The audience responded with nods, claps, and murmurs of agreement. The waitress stepped back slightly, hoping the attention would pass, but instead something else began to happen. A few guests stood from their seats and started making their way toward the stage. One of them, an older woman dressed in a deep blue gown, approached her with tears in her eyes. "My dear," the woman said softly, "that was the most moving performance I've heard in years. Where did you learn to play like that?" The waitress hesitated, her fingers clutching the edge of her uniform. I taught myself," she admitted quietly. "Just at home." The woman's eyes widened, her admiration deepening. "Self-taught? Remarkable." She reached out, gently squeezing the waitress's hand before returning to her seat. Soon others gathered around as well. A man with silver hair asked if she had ever considered performing professionally. Another guest praised her for the emotion in her playing, saying it reminded him of concerts he had attended years ago. Compliments poured in from directions she never expected, each one both overwhelming and humbling. She nodded politely, thanked them softly, but inside she struggled to process it all. Just an hour ago she was invisible. Now she was standing in the center of a spotlight she had never asked for. Her co-workers watched from the sidelines, their faces filled with surprise. Some smiled proudly, others shook their heads as though they were seeing her for the very first time. One of them whispered, "Who knew?" Another replied, "She must have been hiding this talent all along." Amid the crowd of admirers, the waitress finally managed to slip away from the stage. She returned to the service station, hoping to regain some sense of normalcy. She picked up a tray, pretending to busy herself with glasses and plates. But it was no use. Guests kept coming up to her, thanking her, praising her, asking questions about her life and her music. She answered as best she could, though her mind felt like it was still at the piano. Not long after, the host approached her again. "You know," he said kindly, "our scheduled performer still hasn't arrived. Would you be willing to play another piece?" Her heart skipped a beat. Play again? In front of everyone? She hadn't prepared for even one performance, let alone two. She shook her head slightly, unsure. "I don't know if she began, but the host interrupted gently. "You don't have to, of course," he said with understanding, "but everyone would be grateful. You have touched this room tonight in a way few can." She looked back at the piano, standing there under the lights. Her first performance had been pure instinct, a leap she hadn't thought about until she was already in the air. Now the thought of doing it again filled her with both excitement and fear. Yet she could see the faces of the guests nearby, hopeful, curious, waiting. She nodded slowly. "I can try." This time, when she walked back to the piano, the room didn't hold the same skepticism as before. There were no smirks, no whispers of doubt. Instead, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. People leaned forward, ready to listen, eager to hear what she would give them next. She sat down once more, her hands resting on the keys. She thought about which song to play. Should she return to another piece she had practiced endlessly in the quiet of her apartment? Or should she improvise, letting the emotions of this night guide her? She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and decided on the latter. Tonight was not about perfection. It was about honesty. Her fingers began to move again, this time with more confidence. The melody she created was new, born from the energy of the room, from the applause still echoing in her memory, from the realization that people were truly listening. It was lighter than the first piece, filled with hope instead of sorrow. The notes danced rather than cried, carrying the sound of joy, of possibility. The audience responded instantly. Smiles appeared across the room. Some tapped their fingers lightly against the table in rhythm. Others swayed gently in their seats. The music seemed to wrap around them, lifting the heaviness that had hung in the room earlier. Even the servers at the back found themselves smiling, their work momentarily forgotten. The waitress felt it too. Her heart no longer pounded with fear. Instead, it swelled with a sense of belonging. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore, she was playing for all of them, sharing something that connected her to each person in the room. She let her hands fly across the keys faster now, her body leaning into the music, her whole being poured into every note. By the time she reached the end, the ballroom was alive with warmth. The final notes lingered in the air like a soft sigh, and once again the crowd erupted into applause. This time she didn't shrink back. She lifted her head, allowing herself to smile fully, her eyes shining in the glow of the lights. As she stood and bowed, the audience rose with her, giving her a standing ovation. Some guests whistled, others cheered, their claps echoing against the high ceilings. The joy in the room was undeniable, and for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she had more to give the world than she had ever dared to imagine. The host returned to the stage, his voice warm with emotion. "What a gift we have been given tonight," he said. "Sometimes life surprises us in the most unexpected ways. Let's all remember this moment." The young waitress stepped away from the piano, her heart lighter than ever before. She knew her life would not instantly change, that tomorrow she would still wake up early, still work hard, still face struggles. But she also knew something else now. She knew that her music had power to move, to heal, to connect, and that knowledge alone made her feel richer than anyone else in the room. As she returned to her duties, the guests continued to talk about her. Their words followed her through the night, filling her with a quiet hope. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. This night would stay with her forever, etched in her memory like the most beautiful song she had ever played. The night was far from over. After the second round of applause, the young waitress stepped down from the stage once more, her body buzzing with a strange mixture of relief and wonder. She had not planned any of this. She had walked into the evening expecting only another long shift, another night of serving tables and watching life pass her by. Yet here she was, her music still echoing in people's hearts. She tried to return to her duties, but things no longer felt the same. Guests kept stopping her, thanking her and sharing how much her playing had touched them. Some wanted to know more about her story, about how she had learned. Others simply offered warm smiles, their eyes shining in ways that told her they had been moved in ways they couldn't quite put into words. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. Not as someone who carried trays and stayed in the shadows, but as someone who had something to offer. Still, her instincts told her to stay humble, to brush off the attention and slip back into her role. She picked up empty glasses, cleared plates, and moved quietly between tables, though now every step seemed different, lighter. At one of the larger tables near the front, a well-dressed man raised his hand and called out gently, "Excuse me." She walked over, tray in hand, and he smiled warmly. "That music," he said, "it reminded me of my late wife. She was a pianist. For a few minutes I felt as though she were here again. Thank you for that." Her throat tightened. She lowered her gaze, nodded softly, and whispered, "I'm glad the music could do that." She walked away before the emotion in her chest could spill into tears. She hadn't realized until that moment how deeply music could reach into someone's heart, pulling out memories and feelings long buried. As the evening continued, the official pianist finally arrived. There was a murmur among the guests when he entered, looking apologetic and hurried. The host introduced him politely and he made his way to the stage. The young waitress stood at the side of the room, watching quietly as the man sat at the piano and began to play. He was technically brilliant, every note precise, every movement controlled. The melody flowed smoothly, polished and perfect, just as one would expect from someone trained to perform in front of the elite. The audience clapped politely after each piece, but the energy in the room had shifted. The spark that had filled the space when she played wasn't there now. The sound was flawless, but it didn't stir the heart in the same way. She noticed it, and so did the guests. Some glanced at one another, as if comparing the two performances silently. The pianist on stage was the professional, the one who had been paid to fill the evening with music. Yet the memory of the waitress's playing lingered, impossible to forget. It wasn't about perfection, it was about the feeling. When the pianist finished his first piece, the applause was kind but not as wild as before. The waitress clutched her tray tighter, unsure how to feel. She respected him. His talent was undeniable. But part of her wondered if she had, in her own way, touched something he hadn't. She pushed the thought aside, not wanting to compare herself. She wasn't like him. She wasn't trained, she wasn't famous, she wasn't even supposed to be on that stage. She was just someone who loved the piano. Yet as the evening went on, people kept coming back to her. Some whispered, some spoke openly. "You should pursue music," one guest said. "Have you ever thought about performing for real?" asked another. Their words swirled in her mind, leaving her both hopeful and overwhelmed. Later in the night, as dessert was being served, the host approached her again. "Would you mind stepping outside with me for a moment?" he asked kindly. She hesitated. Nervous she might have done something wrong, but his gentle smile reassured her. She followed him out to the quiet hallway just beyond the ballroom. "I want you to know," he began, "that what you did tonight was special. I've hosted many events over the years and I've seen countless performers. But what I saw in that room tonight, it was different. You didn't just play notes, you gave people a piece of yourself. And they felt it." She looked down, unsure how to respond. Compliments had never been easy for her to accept. I just played what I know," she said softly. The host shook his head gently. "No, you did more than that. You reminded people of something real. Don't underestimate what you have." He paused before continuing. "If you ever want to take this further, let me know. I can introduce you to people who might help. But whatever you decide, remember this night. Remember that you have a gift." Her chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was possibility. She nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. When she returned to the ballroom, the night was nearing its end. Guests were gathering their coats, finishing their drinks, and preparing to leave. Yet many of them still stopped by her, offering one last word of thanks or encouragement before they left. Some pressed business cards into her hand, telling her to call if she ever needed guidance or opportunities. She tucked them carefully into her pocket, unsure what she would do with them, but touched all the same. By the time the last guest left and the ballroom grew quiet, she finally let herself breathe. The chandeliers still sparkled above, but the room felt different now, less intimidating, almost welcoming. She walked back to the piano once more, running her fingers lightly across the keys. No one was watching now, no one was listening, but she smiled softly as a single note rang out. Tonight had changed something deep inside her. As she finished her shift and stepped outside into the cool night air, she tilted her head back, staring up at the stars. Her hands still tingled from playing, her heart still full from the applause. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope rise within her, not the fragile kind that fades when reality presses in, but the strong kind that plants itself deep, promising growth. She knew her life would not change overnight. Tomorrow she would still return to work, still face the same challenges. But she carried something new with her now. The memory of a room full of people who listened, who believed, who saw her not as a server but as a musician. She carried the knowledge that her music had power, even if she hadn't believed it herself until tonight. As she walked home under the streetlights, the world seemed a little brighter. Her steps were lighter, her shoulders straighter. She no longer felt like someone trapped in the shadows. She felt like someone who had finally opened a door she never thought she'd be brave enough to touch. And though she didn't yet know where that door would lead, she was ready to follow. The sound of applause echoed through the grand hall, but it was not the kind of applause given politely out of respect. It was loud, genuine, filled with awe, and it went on for what felt like forever. The waitress, who had only stepped forward because her heart told her to, now sat frozen at the piano bench, her fingers still trembling above the keys. She had not expected any of this. She had only wanted to prove, if just to herself, that she could play with honesty and courage. Yet the faces staring back at her were not filled with doubt anymore. they were filled with admiration. The crowd began to rise one by one, until nearly the entire hall stood on their feet. The elite guests who earlier whispered and scoffed at her were now clapping until their hands turned red. For a brief moment she closed her eyes and tried to remember every second, not wanting it to slip away like a passing dream. She felt the warmth of her mother's memory, as if the woman were there beside her, smiling in approval. When the applause finally softened, a man who appeared to be in charge of the event stepped forward. He was an older figure, dressed sharply, clearly someone who managed important occasions like this one. He walked slowly with a look that was not just professional but also personal, as though he too had been touched by what he had just witnessed. He reached out his hand to her and helped her stand. The hall went quiet again, everyone waiting to hear what he would say. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried across the room with steady authority, "we came here tonight expecting a performance from a name we all recognize. But what we have been given is something far greater. We have been reminded that true talent does not need titles or introductions. It reveals itself in the most unexpected places." The room agreed with him in soft murmurs and nods. The waitress lowered her head, humbled and almost overwhelmed. She did not want to cry in front of them, but her eyes felt heavy with tears. The man looked at her again, his expression softening. "This young woman," he continued, "has given us not just music but heart. And that is something we will remember far longer than any performance we paid for." With that, the applause erupted again. She tried to smile through her tears, clutching her hands together as if to ground herself. Strangers she had never met shouted words of encouragement. Some called her a genius, others simply said thank you. For the first time in her life, she felt seen for who she truly was. After the crowd calmed, people began to approach her in groups. At first she felt shy, unsure of how to respond. One guest, a well-known music teacher, introduced herself and spoke with great excitement about offering lessons and guidance. Another spoke of a scholarship program that could help her pursue formal studies. One guest even mentioned that he owned a small recording studio and would love to give her an opportunity to play. It was as though doors that had always been locked were suddenly swinging wide open, one after another. She listened carefully, her heart racing faster with every new offer. For years she had hidden her love for music behind trays of food and quiet evenings playing alone. Now people who once looked down on her uniform were treating her as someone who deserved respect. It felt like a miracle, too much to take in at once. She nodded politely, grateful for every word. But deep down she was also trying to process what this meant for her future. In the corner of the hall, she spotted a small group of other waiters watching her with wide eyes. They looked proud, as if her courage belonged to all of them too. She smiled at them through the crowd, and they smiled back, silently cheering her on. It gave her comfort to know that even in a room full of powerful strangers, she still had friends who understood where she came from. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to leave, many stopped to shake her hand or simply thank her for sharing her gift. She stood by the piano, unsure if she should return to her duties or remain in the spotlight. The manager of the hotel approached her gently and told her to rest. "Tonight you gave more than enough," he said kindly. She bowed her head, relieved. As the hall emptied, she finally sat back down at the piano for a moment, alone this time. She let her fingers hover over the keys, replaying in her mind what had just happened. It was still difficult to believe. Hours earlier, she had been invisible to the same people who now spoke of her with admiration. She whispered a quiet promise to herself, not to let this be the end, not to let fear pull her back into the shadows. That night, when she returned home, her world felt different. The streets were the same, her small apartment unchanged, but something inside her had shifted. She sat by the old keyboard she kept in the corner and touched it gently, almost apologetically, as though it had been waiting all these years for her to believe in herself. She closed her eyes and played a soft tune, one that carried both the memory of her mother and the hope of tomorrow. The following days were filled with unexpected visits and phone calls. The story of the waitress who stunned a room full of elites spread quickly, told and retold by those who had been there. People she had never met wanted to know more about her. Some reached out offering help, others simply offering words of encouragement. The weight of attention felt strange at first, but also uplifting. For once, the world seemed to notice not what she wore or what job she did, but who she was inside. One afternoon, she was invited to visit a small music school. The teacher who had spoken to her at the gala greeted her warmly and led her to a room filled with instruments. The walls were lined with sheet music, the air rich with the sound of young students practicing in nearby rooms. "This could be a place for you," the teacher said. "If you're willing, we can shape your gift into something even greater." She touched the polished keys of a grand piano in the room, feeling nervous but excited. For so long she had played in isolation, teaching herself, listening to her heart. Now for the first time, she would have guidance, structure, and people who believed in her. It was both frightening and thrilling. Weeks turned into months, and her journey continued. She balanced her work at the hotel with lessons at the school, pouring every spare hour into practice. Her progress amazed those around her, but more importantly, it gave her a new sense of purpose. The girl who once doubted whether her music mattered now understood that it could move people, connect hearts, and open doors she never imagined. Looking back, she often thought of that night in the ballroom. She thought of the laughter she heard before she played, the weight of their doubt, and how it all disappeared the moment the music began. That memory stayed with her not as a painful one, but as a reminder of how quickly things can change when someone dares to step forward. The waitress was no longer just a waitress. She was a musician, a dreamer, and above all, someone who finally believed in herself. And for everyone who had been there that night, she remained unforgettable, the young woman who sat at a piano and left a room full of the most powerful people completely speechless. Life began to move in ways the waitress had never imagined. What started as a single performance in front of a room full of strangers had opened doors she once believed would remain closed forever. Each day now carried a sense of possibility, though she still woke up early to tie her apron and serve guests at the hotel. The difference was not in her routine, but in how she felt about herself. Where she once saw only limits, she now saw beginnings. People often asked her if she felt nervous about all the attention, and the truth was she did. Attention was not something she had ever asked for. She had always been comfortable blending into the background, unnoticed, quietly doing her job. But when people discovered her talent, she could no longer hide. Strangers approached her at work to tell her how inspired they were by her story. Some even came to the hotel just to see her, as though she were part of the attraction. It was strange, almost surreal, but she never allowed it to change the way she treated anyone. She still smiled the same way when carrying trays, still listened with patience when someone made small talk, still worked with care because that was who she was. At night, though, her world expanded. The music school she visited had become a second home. She spent hours practicing, not just repeating old pieces, but learning new ones, exploring melodies she had never touched before. Her teacher encouraged her gently, guiding her but also reminding her that her gift came from the heart, not from notes on paper. "Don't lose what makes you different," the teacher often said. "Your music is alive because it carries your story." Sometimes she would sit at the piano in the empty practice room long after lessons ended. The building would grow quiet, the lights dim, but she would continue to play. Those were the moments when she felt closest to her mother, as though each note bridged the gap between past and present. She remembered how her mother once told her that music could heal wounds that words never could. And now, after seeing how her performance touched a room full of people, she knew those words were true. As weeks passed, invitations began to arrive. Small gatherings, charity events, community concerts, people wanted her to play. At first she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to perform in public again. But she reminded herself of that night when she dared to sit at the piano in front of the elites. If she could do it then, she could do it again. So she said yes, and with each performance, her confidence grew. She learned how to face a crowd not with fear, but with calm determination. The audiences were never the same, but their reactions often were. Some cried quietly, others smiled with wonder, but nearly everyone seemed moved in some way. She realized then that music had a power far greater than she had ever understood. It was not just about playing well. It was about reaching into the hearts of others, reminding them of something they had forgotten, or giving them hope they thought they lost. Still, she remained grounded. She continued her job at the hotel, not out of necessity alone, but because it reminded her of where she came from. Some guests whispered about her when she passed, recognizing her as the waitress who played the piano. But she never let their words distract her. She focused on her work, saving her dreams for the evenings when the piano waited for her. One evening, while she was practicing, her teacher entered the room carrying a letter. The teacher's eyes were bright and she sensed it was something important. "This," the teacher said, placing the envelope in her hands, "is an opportunity you cannot ignore." She opened the letter carefully, her hands trembling as her eyes scanned the words. It was an invitation to audition for a conservatory in the city, an institution she had once heard of but never thought she could step foot inside. The thought of it made her chest tighten with both excitement and fear. Could she really belong there? Could she stand among those who had trained their whole lives in music? The doubt returned, whispering cruelly that she was still just a waitress who stumbled onto a stage by accident. Her teacher seemed to sense her fear and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You belong wherever your music takes you," the teacher said softly. "Don't let anyone, not even yourself, tell you otherwise." She nodded, though her heart was heavy with questions. That night she walked home slowly, the letter tucked against her chest. The city lights seemed brighter, as though the world itself was daring her to dream bigger. She thought of her mother again, remembering the times when they would sit together imagining a future filled with music. It felt almost as though her mother had left her this path, guiding her even now. In the weeks that followed, she prepared for the audition. Every spare moment was spent at the piano, practicing until her fingers ached and her back grew sore. There were times when frustration threatened to consume her, when a passage of music seemed impossible to perfect. But she reminded herself that she had already overcome greater obstacles. She had faced doubt, ridicule, and fear, and still she had played. She could not give up now. The day of the audition arrived sooner than she expected. She woke up early, her stomach in knots, unable to eat. The conservatory building was grand and intimidating, with tall doors and wide steps that made her feel small. Inside, the halls echoed with the sound of students warming up, their scales and arpeggios sharp and confident. She clutched her sheet music tightly, trying to steady her breathing. When her name was called, she walked into the audition room, her legs trembling beneath her. A panel of judges sat at a long table, their expressions unreadable. In the center of the room stood a polished grand piano, waiting. For a moment, fear nearly consumed her. But then she remembered that night in the ballroom. She remembered the silence before she played, the weight of their eyes, and the way it all melted when the music began. She took a deep breath, sat down, and let her fingers find the keys. The piece began softly, her hands moving with caution at first, but then she surrendered to the music. Every note carried her story, every phrase a piece of her journey. She forgot the judges, the room, even the piano itself. There was only the sound rising and falling like waves, carrying her beyond her fear. By the time the final note faded, her eyes were wet with tears. The room was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that held weight. Then one of the judges leaned forward and spoke gently. "Thank you," was all they said, but the tone carried more than words could. She bowed her head and left the room, unsure of what the outcome would be, but proud that she had given everything she had. Days later, a letter arrived at her door. She opened it with shaking hands, her heart racing. When her eyes fell on the words, tears streamed down her face. She had been accepted. The conservatory had seen her, not as a waitress pretending to play, but as a musician worthy of learning among them. That night, she sat once again at her old keyboard in her apartment. She placed her fingers on the worn keys, smiling through her tears. Life had changed, yes, but she had not forgotten where it all began. She whispered into the quiet room, as though her mother could hear. "We did it." Then she began to play, filling the small space with music that was no longer just a dream. It was her future. Her first days at the conservatory felt like stepping into another world. The buildings themselves seemed to hum with history, the walls carrying echoes of generations who had come before her. Every hallway was alive with sound, violins tuning, voices singing scales, pianos practicing endlessly. She often paused to listen, her heart swelling with both wonder and doubt. It was overwhelming to think she now belonged here, walking among students who had trained their whole lives for this. At first, she struggled. Her classmates seemed so confident, their fingers flying across the keys with ease, their eyes fixed on sheet music as though it were their native language. She, on the other hand, had learned mostly by ear, guided by instinct rather than formal rules. There were moments she felt small, as though she were a child again, fumbling in the dark while others walked with sure steps. Some students noticed her hesitations and looked at her with curiosity, wondering who she was and how she had gotten here. But she reminded herself why she came. She remembered the applause that filled the ballroom, the strangers who told her she had something rare, the way her music moved people without her needing to explain. And so, even when she felt behind, she pushed forward. She studied harder, practiced longer, and listened carefully to every bit of advice her teachers offered. One evening, after a particularly difficult lesson, she sat alone in one of the practice rooms. Her sheet music lay scattered on the floor, abandoned in frustration. She rested her head on the piano and whispered to herself, "Maybe I'm not good enough." The words felt heavy, dangerous even, as if speaking them aloud could make them true. But then she remembered her mother's voice, the way she always said that music was not about perfection but about honesty. With trembling hands she began to play, not what was written on the pages but something of her own. The melody poured out slowly, carrying her fears and her hope together. By the time she finished, she felt lighter. Unbeknownst to her, someone had been listening outside the door. A fellow student entered quietly, their expression softened. "That," the student said, "was more beautiful than anything I heard today." The waitress-turned student smiled shyly, not knowing what to say. It was the first time she felt that maybe she did belong after all. As weeks turned to months, she grew stronger. Her teachers noticed her progress, praising the way she infused emotion into even the simplest pieces. She began to make friends too, others who admired her courage, who found inspiration in her journey. They often asked her to play for them, not the assigned studies but her own creations. She would laugh nervously but agree, and soon small crowds would gather in practice rooms just to hear her play. Her music carried something raw, something that reminded them why they loved music in the first place. Her reputation within the conservatory began to spread. She was no longer just the new student from an unusual background. She was the one who could make people cry with a single song. And though she still stumbled over complex passages and struggled with theory, her gift was undeniable. Teachers encouraged her to start composing more seriously, suggesting that her future might lie not only in performance, but in creating original works. One day an announcement was made. The conservatory would be hosting a student showcase where select performers would play before an audience of faculty, guests, and visiting musicians. For many, it was a chance to prove themselves, to catch the eye of someone who might help shape their careers. For her, it felt like another impossible mountain. Could she stand on that stage not as a waitress surprising elites, but as a student among peers? Could she offer something worthy of such an audience? Her teacher approached her after class with a knowing smile. "I want you to perform," the teacher said. She froze, her heart hammering. "But I'm not ready," she whispered. The teacher shook their head. "You'll never feel ready. But your music is ready, and that is what matters." In the weeks leading up to the showcase, she poured everything into preparation. She chose not a well-known piece but one of her own compositions, something deeply personal, born from nights at her old keyboard when the world felt heavy and quiet. It was a risk, but she wanted to be true to herself. She practiced until her hands ached, until the melody lived in her bones. There were moments of doubt, but each time she remembered how far she had come. The night of the showcase arrived. The concert hall was grand, filled with polished wood and glittering lights. Students buzzed with nervous energy backstage, some whispering scales to themselves, others pacing. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, trying to steady her breathing. When her name was finally called, she walked onto the stage, her legs weak but her heart determined. The audience was silent as she sat at the piano. For a moment, fear gripped her, but then she closed her eyes and let the music begin. The first notes were soft, delicate, like the beginning of a story. Slowly, the piece unfolded, carrying with it memories of her past, the pain of loss, the hope of dreams, and the courage that had carried her here. She poured everything into it, every note a reflection of who she was. She forgot about the judges, the audience, even herself. There was only the music. When the final chord faded, the hall was still. She opened her eyes, afraid of what she might see. But then the applause began, soft at first, then louder, rising like a wave. People were on their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears from their eyes. She bowed her head, overwhelmed, her heart pounding with relief and joy. Backstage, her classmates embraced her, their faces glowing with admiration. "You did it," they said, one after another. Her teacher smiled proudly, saying nothing at first, only giving her a hug. Finally, the teacher whispered, "This is only the beginning." In the days that followed, she received more attention than ever. People spoke of her performance as the highlight of the evening. Some described it as unforgettable, others as life-changing. She received invitations to perform at other events, to collaborate with composers, to share her gift with wider audiences. But most importantly, she felt something she had not always believed possible. She felt that she truly belonged. And yet, she never forgot where it all started. The night she stepped up to a piano in a ballroom, wearing an apron, unsure if anyone would take her seriously. That moment lived inside every note she played, a reminder that courage often begins in the smallest of choices. Now, as she walked through the conservatory halls, she no longer felt like an outsider. She was a student, a musician, and perhaps even a future composer. But most of all, she was someone who had learned that music was not about perfection or titles. It was about honesty, courage, and the power to touch hearts. Her story was still unfolding, each day a new chapter, but whatever came next, she knew she would meet it with the same spirit that had carried her this far. And somewhere deep inside, she felt her mother's presence still, guiding her with every note, reminding her that she was never truly alone.